In the summer of 1933, under the blazing Ohio sun, a man stood
Top
among
Gun này đáng
thousands
sợ
of
chưa?
Americans
Vẫn
at the
ổn, xin kết
Cleveland
quả thực
National
tiễn.
Air Races. He wore a simple linen suit, sweat gathering at his collar, his eyes locked on the sky above. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another aviation enthusiast, another face in the crowd, another dreamer gazing upward at the miracle of flight. But this man was no ordinary spectator. His name was Erhard Volker, and 20 years earlier, he had been one of the deadliest men alive. Erhard was 35 years old that summer. His hair had begun to gray at the temples, and fine lines had carved themselves around his eyes. But those eyes still held the same intensity they had during the Great War, when he had stalked the skies over France in a Fokker triplane, hunting Allied aircraft with the patience of a wolf. 62 confirmed kills. That was his number. 62 enemy planes sent spiraling to the earth in flames. 62 pilots who never made it home. Only one man in all of Germany had claimed more aerial victories during the war, the legendary Red Baron himself. But the Red Baron was dead, shot down over the Somme in 1918. Erhard Volker had survived, and now standing in the heart of America surrounded by the smell of popcorn and engine oil and sun-baked grass, he was about to witness something that would change the course of history. The announcer's voice crackled through the loudspeakers, building anticipation for the next demonstration. The crowd buzzed with excitement. Children sat on their father's shoulders, pointing at the sky. Young couples held hands, necks craned upward. Veterans of the Great War stood with arms crossed, judging every maneuver with the critical eyes of men who had seen real combat. Erhard understood their skepticism. Since the war, he had made his living as a stunt pilot, performing aerial acrobatics across Europe. He had seen every trick imaginable: barrel rolls, loop-the-loops, inverted flight, wing walking. He had performed them all himself, pushing aircraft to their limits for the gasping crowds below. He thought he had seen everything the sky had to offer. He was wrong. The aircraft that climbed into the sky that afternoon was a Curtiss Bf-2C Goshawk, a compact, powerful biplane with a radial engine that gleamed like polished silver in the sunlight. The pilot took the plane higher and higher until it became a small cross against the endless blue. Then it happened. The Goshawk's nose dropped, not into a gentle dive, not into the kind of controlled descent that Erhard had performed 1,000 times. The aircraft pitched forward until it was pointing almost straight down at the earth, 90 degrees vertical. The crowd gasped. Erhard felt his heart stop. The Goshawk plummeted toward the ground like a stone dropped from heaven. The engine screamed, the wind howled. The pilot sat motionless in the cockpit, hands steady on the controls, as the earth rushed up to meet him at over 300 miles per hour. Erhard could not breathe. His hands gripped the wooden railing in front of him so hard that splinters bit into his palms. Every instinct he had developed over 2 decades of flying told him the same thing. This pilot was going to die. No aircraft could survive such forces. No human body could withstand the stress of pulling out from such a dive. The wings would tear off. The fuselage would crumple. The pilot would black out from the crushing weight of gravity multiplied upon itself. But none of that happened. At the last possible moment, the Goshawk's nose began to rise. The pilot pulled back on the stick with perfect precision, and the aircraft arced out of its death dive, leveling off just a few hundred feet above the ground. A small object fell from beneath the plane. A practice bomb. It struck a painted target in the center of the airfield with pinpoint accuracy. The crowd erupted in cheers. Erhard stood frozen, his mind racing. He had just witnessed something impossible become possible. He had just seen the future of aerial warfare demonstrated in front of 50,000 cheering Americans who had no idea what they were looking at. Dive bombing, the concept was not entirely new. Pilots had been experimenting with steep attack angles since the Great War, but no one had ever achieved this level of precision, this level of control, this level of devastation delivered from directly above. In his mind, Erhard saw the implications unfolding like a dark flower blooming. He saw bridges collapsing, ships sinking, artillery batteries silenced, enemy positions obliterated before ground troops ever had to cross the wire. He saw a weapon that could change everything. And he knew standing there in the heart of America that he had to bring this knowledge back to Germany. The weeks that followed were filled with questions. Erhard attended every demonstration he could find. He spoke with American pilots, engineers, mechanics. He asked about stress tolerances and dive angles and recovery techniques. He smiled and nodded and bought drinks for anyone willing to talk. The Americans were generous with their knowledge. They had no reason to be secretive. The United States was not preparing for war. They were simply developing new techniques for naval aviation, new ways to attack enemy ships from the air. It was all theoretical, academic, interesting but ultimately harmless. They had no idea who they were talking to. Earhart took careful notes. He sketched diagrams in small notebooks that he kept hidden in his hotel room. He memorized specifications, performance data, structural requirements. And all the while, a plan was forming in his mind. He needed a goshawk of his own, not for air shows, not for entertainment, but to study, to master, to dissect and understand so that Germany could build something even better. The problem was money. A Curtiss Goshawk cost more than Earhart could earn in a decade of barnstorming. His air show brought in enough to survive, but not enough for cutting-edge American military aircraft. He needed a patron, someone with deep pockets and a vested interest in German air power. He needed Conrad Stahl. Conrad Stahl was not a man who inspired affection. He was large, loud, and possessed of an ego that seemed to occupy every room he entered before he did. He had been a fighter pilot during the Great War, though his record was unremarkable. 12 kills, respectable but nothing compared to legends like Volker or the Red Baron. What Stahl lacked in aerial prowess, he made up for in political ambition. He had joined the National Socialist movement, early recognizing in Adolf Hitler a kindred spirit, a man who understood the power of spectacle, the importance of myth. By 1933, Stahl had risen to become the head of German aviation. Officially, this position did not exist. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from building an air force, but treaties were just paper and paper could be burned. In secret, Stahl was building the Luftwaffe. When Earhart's letter arrived requesting a meeting to discuss a matter of great importance to German aviation, Stahl was intrigued. Volker was a legend, a hero of the Great War. His name carried weight that money could not buy. The meeting took place in a private room in Berlin. Stahl sat behind a massive oak desk, smoking a cigar that filled the air with blue haze. Earhart stood before him, hat in hand, explaining what he had seen in Cleveland. At first, Stahl was skeptical. Dive bombing sounded like a circus trick, a stunt for air shows, not real combat. But Earhart persisted. He drew diagrams. He quoted specifications. He painted a picture of German aircraft screaming down from the heavens, delivering their payloads with unprecedented accuracy, destroying enemy targets before anti-aircraft guns could even track them. Slowly, Stahl's expression changed. The skepticism faded. In its place came something else: hunger. The deal was simple. Stahl would provide the money to purchase 2 Curtiss Goshawks. They would be shipped to Germany in pieces, hidden among agricultural equipment, and reassembled in secret facilities. Earhart would test them, master them, and share everything he learned with the Luftwaffe's engineers. In exchange, Earhart would join the Nazi Party. This was the part that gave him pause. Earhart had never been a political man. He cared about flying, not ideology. The petty squabbles of politicians seemed irrelevant compared to the freedom of the open sky. But he wanted those Goshawks. He needed them. The knowledge they contained was too valuable to let slip through his fingers. And so in the autumn of 1933, Earhart Volker signed his name to a membership card bearing the swastika. He told himself it was just a formality, just paperwork. It did not change who he was or what he believed. He would remember those words later. In the dark hours before dawn, when sleep would not come and the faces of the dead visited him like ghosts, he would remember how easy it had been to compromise, how simple it was to take the first step down a road that led to hell. But that reckoning was still years away. For now, there was only excitement, only possibility, only the promise of 2 gleaming aircraft waiting to reveal their secrets. The Goshawks arrived in Germany in early 1934. Earhart had them assembled at a small airfield outside Munich, far from prying eyes. He spent weeks studying them before he ever climbed into a cockpit. He examined every rivet, every cable, every structural member. He understood that the key to dive bombing was not courage or skill alone. It was engineering. An aircraft diving at extreme angles experienced forces that could tear it apart. The wings wanted to fold upward. The tail wanted to rip away. The engine wanted to tear free from its mounts. To survive a true dive bombing attack, every component had to be stronger than logic suggested. Overbuilt, redundant. The Americans had solved this problem through careful design and conservative limits. They never pushed their aircraft beyond what the structure could handle. They treated the dive as a precision instrument, not a blunt weapon. Earhart intended to push further. His first test flights were cautious. 45-degree dives, 50 degrees, 60. Each time he carefully monitored the aircraft's response, noting the vibrations, the stresses, the behavior of the controls. Each time the Goshawk performed beautifully. He grew bolder. On a cold morning in March, Earhart climbed to 15,000 feet and pointed the Goshawk's nose straight down. The airspeed indicator wound past 300 miles per hour. The controls grew heavy in his hands. The wind screamed past the canopy like a living thing. He released a practice bomb and pulled back on the stick. The G-forces hit him like a giant's fist. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. Gray crept in from the edges. But he held the pullout, fighting through the disorientation until the Goshawk was level again and the earth had stopped rushing toward him. The bomb had struck within 20 feet of the target. Earhart laughed out loud in the cockpit, a wild, exhilarant sound that was swallowed by the engine noise. He had done it. He had mastered the technique, and now he knew exactly what Germany needed to build. But his celebration was premature. 3 weeks later, on another test flight, Earhart pushed the Goshawk too far. He was practicing a particularly aggressive dive, steeper and faster than any he had attempted before. The aircraft was performing well. The controls responded. The structure held. Then he heard it, a sound like a gunshot, a crack that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Goshawk shuddered. The controls went slack in his hands. Earhart had less than a second to understand what had happened before the world came apart. The wing spar had failed. The main structural member that held the wing together had snapped under the accumulated stress of dozens of extreme dives. The right wing folded upward like a broken bird's, and the Goshawk began to tumble out of control. Earhart did not hesitate. His hands found the canopy release. His body knew what to do, even as his mind was still processing the catastrophe. He threw himself out of the spinning aircraft and into the void. The fall seemed to last forever. The ground rotated beneath him. The sky wheeled above. He could see the Goshawk continuing its death spiral, pieces tearing away as it fell. Then his hand found the ripcord, and the parachute deployed with a violent jerk that knocked the breath from his lungs. He floated down through the cold German air, watching the wreckage of the Goshawk scatter across a farmer's field below. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking, but his mind was clear enough to understand what the failure meant. The American design was good, but it was not good enough. Not for the kind of warfare Earhart envisioned. Not for the sustained, repeated, punishing dives that would be required in real combat. Germany needed something stronger. Something purpose-built for the task. Germany needed a new aircraft. As his boots touched the frozen earth and the silk of his parachute settled around him like a shroud, Erhard Volker made a decision. He would not rest until that aircraft existed, no matter what it cost. The proposal landed on the desks of the German Air Ministry in the spring of 1934. It called for the development of a dedicated dive bomber built from the ground up for the task. Not an adapted fighter, not a modified biplane, a purpose-designed aircraft that could survive the stresses of near-vertical dives and deliver its payload with pinpoint accuracy. The response was mixed. Some officials were enthusiastic. They had heard Erhard's reports. They understood the tactical implications. They saw dive bombing as the future of close air support, a way to extend the reach of artillery to anywhere an aircraft could fly. Others were skeptical. Dive bombing was a stunt, they said, a trick for air shows. Real war required level bombers, heavy aircraft that could carry massive payloads to strategic targets. The dive bomber was a distraction, a waste of resources that could be better spent elsewhere. The debate raged through the spring and into the summer. But eventually the enthusiasts won. A competition was announced. German aircraft companies were invited to submit designs for the new dive bomber. The winner would receive a contract to build the future of the Luftwaffe. Two companies rose to the challenge. The first was Junkers, one of Germany's oldest and most respected aircraft manufacturers. Their design team was led by a brilliant engineer named Oskar Brenner, a man who had spent his entire career pushing the boundaries of what aircraft could do. Brenner's proposal was designated the Ju-87. The second was Heinkel, led by a designer named Heinrich Frankel. Frankel's aircraft, the He-118, was sleeker, faster, more conventional in its approach. It looked like a fighter that happened to carry bombs rather than a dedicated dive bomber. On paper, the He-118 was superior in almost every way. It was faster in level flight. It was more maneuverable. It had better range. The only category where the Ju-87 excelled was in its dive characteristics. Brenner had designed the aircraft specifically for near-vertical attacks, incorporating features that seemed bizarre to conventional aviation thinking. Inverted gull wings that improved visibility during dives. Fixed landing gear that added drag but also stability. Massive dive brakes that could slow the aircraft's descent to controllable speeds. An automatic pull-out system that would save the pilot if he blacked out from G-forces. The Ju-87 was ugly, ungainly, slow. It looked like nothing else in the sky. And that was exactly why Erhard Volker loved it. He visited Brenner's design team repeatedly during development, offering insights from his testing of the Goshawks. He explained the forces involved, the stresses that needed to be managed, the techniques that pilots would use in combat. Brenner listened carefully, incorporating Volker's feedback into each revision of the design. A bond formed between the two men, the pilot and the engineer, the warrior and the craftsman. They shared a vision of what the Ju-87 could become, and they worked together to make that vision real. But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. By the spring of 1936, the Air Ministry had grown impatient. The Ju-87 was years behind schedule. The prototypes had suffered numerous setbacks, including a catastrophic crash that killed Juncker's top test pilot. Meanwhile, the He-118 was performing well in trials, meeting or exceeding all specifications. The decision-makers began to lean toward Heinkel. On June 9, 1936, the order came down. The Ju-87 program was to be terminated. All resources were to be redirected to the He-118, which would become the Luftwaffe's primary dive bomber. When Erhard heard the news, something inside him went cold. He had invested 3 years of his life in this aircraft. He had survived a near-fatal crash, proving the concept. He had worked alongside Brenner through countless setbacks and revisions. And now, with a stroke of a bureaucrat's pen, it was all being swept away. The Ju-87 was not just an aircraft to him. It was a dream made physical. A vision of the future that he had carried back from Cleveland, nurtured through years of struggle, and was now watching die. But Erhard Volker had not survived 62 aerial combats by giving up easily. He requested a meeting with Conrad Stahl. The conversation lasted 3 hours. Erhard spoke with a passion that surprised even himself. He argued that the He-118, for all its impressive specifications, was not a true dive bomber. It was a compromise, a conventional aircraft modified for an unconventional role. It would perform adequately in testing, but it would fail in the crucible of real combat. The Ju-87, on the other hand, had been built for one purpose and one purpose only. It sacrificed speed and elegance for strength and precision. It was not pretty, but it was effective. And in war, effectiveness was all that mattered. Stahl listened. He smoked his cigars. He asked questions. And when Erhard was finished, he made a decision that would change the course of history. On June 10, 1936, one day after the cancellation order, Erhard Volker was promoted to Chief of Development and Research for the entire Luftwaffe. His first official act was to cancel the cancellation. The Ju-87 program was revived. Brenner's team was given new resources, new priorities, new urgency. The aircraft would continue development, and it would compete fairly against the He-118 in final trials. But fate had one more twist in store. 1 month later, in July of 1936, Erhard decided to personally test the He-118. He wanted to see for himself what the competing aircraft could do. He wanted to push it to its limits, the way he had pushed the Goshawk, the way he intended to push the Ju-87. The test took place on a clear summer morning. Erhard climbed into the He-118's cockpit, ran through the pre-flight checklist, and took off into the blue German sky. He climbed to 12,000 feet, lined up on a target below, and pushed the nose down into a steep dive. The He-118 responded beautifully at first. The controls were light responsive. The airspeed built rapidly. Earhart felt the familiar rush of acceleration, the weight of G-forces beginning to press against his chest. Then the propeller exploded. The blades, spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, simply came apart. Fragments of metal tore through the aircraft's skin, shredding the engine, cowling, puncturing the fuel tanks. The HE-118 shuddered, and then it began to disintegrate around him. For the second time in his life, Erhard Volker found himself falling through the sky with only a parachute between him and death. He pulled the ripcord. The canopy deployed, and as he floated down toward the earth, he watched the He-118 scatter itself across the German countryside in a trail of burning debris. When he landed, Heinrich Frankel was waiting for him, and the designer's face was purple with rage. The aircraft was not designed for such maneuvers, Frankel shouted. It was never meant to be pushed to those extremes. The test was unfair, irresponsible, reckless. Erhard listened in silence. Then he said the words that ended the competition forever. A dive bomber that cannot dive is not a dive bomber. It is a coffin with wings. 1 week later, the Ju-87 was officially declared the winner of the Air Ministry's competition. The HE-118 program was canceled. Germany's dive bomber would be Oskar Brenner's ungainly inverted gull-winged fixed-gear creation. The aircraft that the world would come to know as the Stuka. The name came later. Sturzkampfflugzeug, diving fighting plane. The full name was too long for casual use, so the pilots shortened it, Stuka. It rolled off the tongue like a curse, like a prayer, like the sound of a predator calling to its prey. In the months that followed, the Ju-87 underwent final modifications. The B model incorporated all the lessons learned from years of testing and development. Dive brakes that extended from the wings like claws, slowing the aircraft's descent to manageable speeds. An automatic pull-out system that would bring the aircraft level even if the pilot lost consciousness. A bomb release mechanism that swung the payload clear of the propeller arc before dropping. And one final addition requested by Erhard Volker himself. Sirens, small propeller-driven devices mounted on the landing gear fairings. When the Stuka dove, the propellers spun, generating a sound unlike anything heard before in the skies of Europe. A wailing, screaming howl that rose in pitch and intensity as the aircraft plummeted toward its target. The Jericho trumpets, they would come to be called, after the biblical horns that brought down the walls of an ancient city. Erhard had studied fear. He understood that a weapon's psychological impact could be as devastating as its physical destruction. The scream of the Stuka would announce death before it arrived. It would freeze men in their tracks, scramble their rash thoughts, make them forget their training. By the time the bombs fell, the battle would already be half won. Some in the Air Ministry thought the sirens were frivolous. They added drag to the aircraft, reducing its already modest speed. They served no practical purpose in the mechanics of dive bombing. Erhard did not argue. He simply ordered the sirens installed on every production aircraft. Years later, veterans who had survived Stuka attacks would describe that sound in their memoirs. They would call it the sound of the devil, the voice of death itself. They would say that nothing in their experience of war, not artillery bombardments, not machine gun fire, not the screams of dying men, had terrified them as completely as the howl of a diving Stuka. Erhard had created more than an aircraft. He had created a weapon of terror. And as the Ju-87 rolled off production lines in late 1937, as pilots began training for the dive bombing missions that would soon reshape the map of Europe, Erhard Volker allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had done it. Against all odds, against skeptics and bureaucrats and the laws of physics themselves, he had brought his vision to life. The dream he had glimpsed in Cleveland, standing among the corn-fed crowds of Ohio, was now taking to the skies over Germany. The Stuka was ready for war. But war, as Erhard would soon discover, has a way of twisting dreams into nightmares. As he watched the first squadron of Ju-87s take off on a training mission, their sirens silent, their bomb racks empty their wings, catching the golden light of the setting sun, he could not see the future that awaited them all. He could not see the burning ships at Norway, the shattered cities of Poland, the screaming soldiers on the beaches of Dunkirk, the wreckage of his own creations scattered across the fields of Britain. He could not see the thousands who would die torn apart by weapons he had helped design, deafened by sirens he had demanded. He could not see the morning still years away when he would sit alone in his study in Berlin, a pistol in his hand, unable to bear the weight of what he had unleashed upon the world. All he could see in that golden moment was the beauty of flight, the dream of the sky, the promise of victory, and the sleek, ugly, ungainly shape of the Ju-87 Stuka climbing toward the heavens like a bird of prey, ascending to its perch, patient and hungry, waiting for the hunt to begin. The first Stukas to taste combat did so far from the eyes of the world. In the summer of 1937, civil war was consuming Spain. Nationalist forces under General Francisco Franco battled Republican loyalists for control of the country, and both sides had powerful friends. The Soviet Union sent weapons and advisors to the Republicans. Germany sent something far more valuable. They sent the Condor Legion. Officially, the Condor Legion did not exist. Germany was bound by international treaties that forbade military intervention in foreign conflicts. But Adolf Hitler had never let paper promises stand in the way of his ambitions. Under the cover of secrecy, German pilots and aircraft were shipped to Spain to fight alongside Franco's nationalists. Among them were 5 Ju-87A Stukas. It was not a large force, just enough to test the aircraft under real combat conditions, just enough to learn what worked and what did not, just enough to turn theory into practice before the larger war that everyone knew was coming. The Stukas flew their first combat missions in January of 1938. They struck bridges, supply depots, troop concentrations. They dove out of the Spanish sun and delivered their payloads with the precision that Erhard Volker had always promised. The results exceeded expectations. Republican soldiers who survived Stuka attacks reported a new kind of terror. They spoke of aircraft that seemed to fall straight down from the sky, screaming like demons. They spoke of explosions that landed exactly where they were standing, as if the bombs had eyes. They spoke of a sound that haunted their dreams long after the raids were over. The wail of the Jericho trumpets had found its first victims. Back in Germany, Erhard read the after-action reports with growing satisfaction. The Stuka was proving itself in the crucible of combat. Every mission provided new data, new insights, new refinements. The pilots learned how to approach targets, how to time their dives, how to work together as a unit. The ground crews learned how to maintain the aircraft under field conditions, how to repair battle damage, how to keep the sirens screaming. By the time the Spanish Civil War ended in early 1939, the Luftwaffe had accumulated thousands of hours of combat experience. They had tested their aircraft, their tactics, and their men. They were ready for the main event. The invasion of Poland began at 4:45 in the morning on September 1st, 1939. In the gray pre-light, German forces poured across the border from 3 directions. Tanks rumbled through the Polish countryside. Infantry advanced behind them. Artillery shells screamed overhead. And leading them all high above the chaos flew the Stukas. The Luftwaffe had assembled 9 Sturzkampfgeschwader for the Polish campaign, 9 wings of dive bombers, each containing roughly 40 aircraft. Over 300 Stukas in total, more than had ever been concentrated in one place before. Their first targets were Polish airfields. Before the sun had fully risen, Stukas were diving on hangars, runways, and aircraft caught on the ground. The Polish Air Force, though brave and determined, never had a chance. Dozens of their planes were destroyed before they could even take off. Those that did manage to get airborne found themselves hopelessly outnumbered, hunted by swarms of German fighters while the Stukas continued their methodical destruction below. Within days, the Polish Air Force had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. With the skies clear, the Stukas turned their attention to the Polish army. This was where the true nature of the Ju-87 revealed itself. This was where Erhard Volker's vision of close air support became reality. German ground commanders had been equipped with radios that could communicate directly with Stuka units overhead. When they encountered resistance, when they found their advance blocked by fortified positions or enemy armor, they called for help. And help arrived with terrifying speed. Within minutes of a request, Stukas would appear over the battlefield. They would circle once, twice, identifying their targets. Then they would peel off one by one and begin their dives. The effect on Polish defenders was devastating. Men who had been fighting bravely against German infantry found themselves suddenly exposed to attack from directly above. They could hear the Stukas coming before they saw them. That terrible scream building in intensity as the aircraft plunged downward. Then the bombs would fall, landing with impossible accuracy on bunkers, artillery positions, command posts. The surviving Polish soldiers would emerge from cover shaken and disoriented, only to find German tanks already rolling through the gaps the Stukas had created. It was a new kind of warfare. Lightning war. blitzkrieg, and the Stuka was its sword. One incident from the Polish campaign became legendary among Luftwaffe pilots. On the very first day of the invasion, a Stuka unit was assigned to destroy a set of demolition cables that the Poles had laid across the Vistula River. The cables were designed to detonate charges that would destroy the bridges, slowing the German advance. Finding such targets from the air was considered nearly impossible. The cables were thin camouflaged, hidden among the debris of the riverbank. A level bomber flying at altitude would never spot them. Even low-level attacks would struggle to hit something so small. The Stukas found them anyway. Diving from 12,000 feet, the pilots spotted the cables against the pattern of the river below. They released their bombs with the same precision they had practiced for years. The explosions severed the cables before they could be triggered. The bridges remained standing. The German advance continued unhindered. When reports of this strike reached Berlin, even skeptics who had doubted the value of dive bombing were forced to reconsider. The Stuka had achieved what no other aircraft could. It had proven that air power could be surgical, precise, integrated with ground operations in ways that had never been possible before. Poland fell in 36 days. The Stukas had led the way. The world watched in horror. Newsreels showed the destruction. Newspapers printed photographs of burning cities, fleeing refugees. The distinctive bent wings of the Ju-87 silhouetted against smoke-filled skies. The New York Times ran a front-page story about the new German dive bomber just days after the invasion began. But much of the early reporting was inaccurate. Information about the Stuka was scarce, and journalists filled the gaps with speculation. One article described the Ju-87 as fast, when in fact it was one of the slowest combat aircraft in the Luftwaffe. Another claimed that Stukas had been spotted at Pearl Harbor years later when no such thing had occurred. The confusion only added to the aircraft's mystique. What was this screaming terror that fell from the sky? How could any plane dive straight down without breaking apart? What kind of men would fly such missions plummeting toward the Earth at 400 miles per hour, with nothing but a pull of the stick standing between them and oblivion? The Stuka had become more than an aircraft. It had become a legend. And legends, as the Luftwaffe would soon discover, can be both blessing and curse. The invasion of Norway began on April 9, 1940. German forces landed at multiple points along the Norwegian coast, supported by naval vessels and paratroopers. The objective was to secure Norway's ports and airfields before the British could intervene, ensuring German access to Swedish iron ore and denying the Royal Navy a potential base of operations. The Stukas were there from the beginning, but Norway presented challenges that Poland had not. The terrain was mountainous, heavily forested, carved by deep fjords that made navigation difficult. Finding targets in such landscape was far harder than it had been on the Polish plains. Close air support for ground troops was complicated by the poor visibility and rapidly changing weather. However, the Germans soon discovered another use for their dive bombers. Naval attack. The Royal Navy had dispatched a powerful force to oppose the German landings. British cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers prowled the waters off Norway, hunting German transports and providing fire support for Allied troops on the ground. The Stukas hunted them in turn. On April 9th, the same day the invasion began, Ju-87s located a Norwegian destroyer off the coast. The ship's captain saw the aircraft approaching and ordered evasive maneuvers. The vessel began to zigzag, trying to throw off the bomber's aim. Against level bombers, such tactics would have been effective. High-altitude aircraft struggling to hit a moving target would waste most of their bombs on empty water. The mathematics of aerial attack favored the defender. But the Stukas were not level bombers. They dove straight down, tracking the destroyer's movements, adjusting their aim in real time. The ship could not outrun aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour. It could not dodge bombs released from directly overhead. The first explosion struck near the bow. The second hit amidships. The destroyer lurched, began taking on water, and within minutes had run aground on the Norwegian coast. Her crew abandoned ship before she could sink. It was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, the Stukas carved a path of destruction through the Royal Navy's forces. On April 17th, they attacked the cruiser HMS Suffolk, scoring multiple hits that forced her to limp back to Scotland with 33 dead aboard. On April 30th, HMS Bittern took a bomb directly into her magazine and exploded in a pillar of flame. On May 3rd, during the evacuation of Namsos, a British destroyer and a French destroyer were both sent to the bottom by Stuka attacks. The Royal Navy, the most powerful fleet in the world, was being savaged by aircraft that bureaucrats had once dismissed as too slow and underpowered for modern combat. The lesson was clear. Ships were vulnerable to dive bombing in a way they had never been vulnerable to any previous form of aerial attack. The precision of the Stuka negated the advantages of speed and maneuver that had always protected naval vessels from high-altitude bombers. Anti-aircraft guns blazed away at the diving aircraft, filling the sky with flak. But the Stukas were difficult targets. They approached from high altitude where the guns had trouble reaching. They dove at steep angles, presenting a small profile. They released their bombs and pulled away before the gunners could adjust their aim. Ship after ship fell victim to the screaming devils from above. And in Berlin, Erhard Volker received reports of each victory with a mixture of pride and unease. The Stuka was performing exactly as he had envisioned. It was dominating the battlefield, rewriting the rules of naval warfare, proving that air power could project force in ways that had never been possible before. But something was troubling him. In Poland, the Luftwaffe had owned the skies completely. The Polish Air Force had been destroyed on the first day. The Stukas had operated with impunity, diving on their targets without fear of interception. In Norway, it was different. The Royal Air Force had been present, if only in limited numbers. And when RAF fighters did manage to intercept Stuka formations, the results were troubling. Erhard had seen the casualty reports. He had read the accounts of pilots who had barely escaped with their lives. The Stuka, for all its strengths, was slow. It was unmaneuverable in level flight. Its defensive armament was limited to a single rear-facing machine gun. When enemy fighters caught a Stuka in the open, the outcome was rarely in doubt. So far, this weakness had been masked by careful tactics and overwhelming numbers. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt 109s had kept enemy fighters busy while the Stukas did their work. The few losses that occurred were acceptable given the destruction the dive bombers were inflicting. But Erhard could not shake the feeling that they were playing a dangerous game. The Stuka's success depended on air superiority. Without it, the dive bomber would transform from predator to prey. He mentioned his concerns to Konrad Stahl during a meeting in Berlin. Stahl laughed them off. The Luftwaffe was invincible, he declared. No air force in the world could stand against them. The British had been beaten in Norway. They would be beaten again in France. And when the time came, they would be beaten over their own island as well. Erhard said nothing more, but the unease remained coiled in his chest like a sleeping serpent. The invasion of France began on May 10, 1940. German forces smashed through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line. Panzer divisions raced across the French countryside, covering ground at speeds that seemed impossible. Infantry followed in trucks and on foot, consolidating the gains the tanks had made. And overhead, always overhead, flew the Stukas. The French had more aircraft than the Poles. They had better equipment, better training, better organization. But it made no difference. The Luftwaffe swept them from the sky with brutal efficiency, and the Stukas continued their reign of terror unchallenged. The breakthrough at Sedan became the defining moment of the campaign. German forces had reached the Meuse River, a natural barrier that should have halted their advance. French defenders held the opposite bank, dug in behind fortifications, supported by artillery. A conventional crossing would have been costly, perhaps impossible. The Stukas made it simple. On May 13th, nearly 300 Ju-87s attacked the French positions at Sedan. They dove in waves, each aircraft adding its payload to the destruction. The bombardment lasted for hours. French bunkers were obliterated. Artillery batteries were silenced. Communications were severed. When the attack finally ended, the surviving defenders were too stunned to resist. German engineers crossed the river almost unopposed. Within hours, tanks were rolling across pontoon bridges into the heart of France. The battle was over before it truly began. Similar scenes played out across the front. Wherever German ground forces encountered resistance, the Stukas appeared to eliminate it. The French army, supposedly one of the finest in Europe, crumbled under the combined assault. But it was at Dunkirk that the Stuka achieved its most infamous moments. By late May, the German advance had trapped nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers against the English Channel. British and French forces crowded onto the beaches around the port of Dunkirk, desperately waiting for evacuation. They were sitting targets. The Stukas came in waves. Day after day, they dove on the packed beaches, on the assembled ships, on the long lines of soldiers wading into the water. The Jericho trumpets screamed their terrible song. Bombs exploded among men who had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The evacuation became a nightmare of smoke and fire and blood. Soldiers who survived those days at Dunkirk would carry the memories for the rest of their lives. They would wake in the night decades later still hearing that sound. That rising wail that meant death was falling from the sky. An entire generation was traumatized by the scream of the Stuka, and yet even in the midst of their triumph, the first cracks were appearing. It happened on May 12, 1940. A flight of 12 Stukas was returning from a mission near Sedan when they were intercepted by 6 Curtiss P-36 Hawks. French fighters, not the latest models, not particularly fast or well-armed. Aircraft that many considered obsolete by 1940 standards. The Stukas were caught without escort. Their Messerschmitt Guardians had been drawn away by another engagement. The dive bombers were alone, vulnerable, heavy with fuel and light on ammunition. The P-36s attacked from above and behind. What followed was a slaughter. The French pilots dove through the Stuka formation, guns blazing. The German bombers tried to evade, but their aircraft were not built for dogfighting. They were slow, clumsy, unable to outrun or outmaneuver the nimble French fighters. One by one, the Stukas fell. Some exploded in midair, hit in their fuel tanks or bomb loads. Others spiraled down, trailing smoke, their pilots struggling to bail out before impact. A few managed to escape, diving toward the deck and racing for home at maximum speed. When the engagement ended, 6 Stukas had been destroyed. Several more were damaged. The French had lost only a single aircraft. The surviving German pilots reported what had happened. Their accounts were passed up the chain of command, analyzed, filed away, and then they were ignored. The Luftwaffe was winning. France was falling. The overall success of the campaign obscured the warning signs. What did a few lost aircraft matter when the enemy was in full retreat? Erhard Volker saw the reports. He understood what they meant. The Stuka was only invincible when it had the sky to itself. The moment enemy fighters appeared in force, the moment air superiority was contested, the dive bomber became a liability rather than an asset. He tried to raise his concerns with the high command. He suggested that Stuka operations should be limited to areas where air superiority had been firmly established. He recommended that escort requirements should be increased, that formations should be smaller and more dispersed. His recommendations were noted and disregarded. The victory in France was complete. The British had been driven from the continent. The Luftwaffe had proven itself the most powerful air force in the world. Why would anyone listen to warnings about a weapon that had just conquered an empire? The Battle of Britain began in July of 1940. Adolf Hitler had hoped that the British would sue for peace after the fall of France. They did not. Winston Churchill, the new prime minister, declared that Britain would fight on alone, that they would never surrender, that they would defend their island, whatever the cost. Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to prepare for invasion. The plan was simple, in concept challenging, in execution. Before German troops could cross the English Channel, the Royal Air Force had to be destroyed. Once the RAF was eliminated, the Luftwaffe would have free rein over the invasion beaches. Without air cover, the Royal Navy would be torn apart by dive bombers, just as it had been in Norway. The landings would proceed and Britain would fall. Conrad Stahl assembled every available aircraft for the coming battle. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, and of course the Stukas. The dive bombers were expected to play a starring role in the campaign. They would strike British radar stations, airfields, port facilities. They would sink the ships that tried to interfere with German operations. They would break the back of British resistance just as they had broken France. No one in the Luftwaffe High Command seemed to consider the possibility that things might go differently. The early weeks of the battle went well enough. Stukas attacked British shipping in the Channel, sinking freighters and damaging warships. On July 4th, they destroyed 4 merchant vessels in a single day. On July 25th, they scored hits on an armed auxiliary cruiser, killing over 100 of her crew. On land, the results were mixed but promising. During what the Germans called Eagle Day on August 13, 86, Stukas of Sturzkampfgeschwader, one attacked an RAF airfield. They destroyed 20 aircraft on the ground, killed the station commander, and leveled hangars and maintenance buildings. For a moment, it seemed like Poland and France all over again. Then the RAF adapted. British pilots had been studying the Stuka since the beginning of the war. They had analyzed its performance characteristics, its tactics, its vulnerabilities, and they had developed countermeasures. The key insight was simple but devastating. The Stuka's automatic pullout system, the feature that had saved so many pilots from G-force blackouts, was also predictable. After releasing its bombs, the aircraft would enter a climbing turn at a specific angle at a specific speed, following a specific trajectory. A pilot who knew this could predict exactly where the Stuka would be after its attack run. RAF fighters began to time their intercepts accordingly. They would wait until the Stukas had committed to their dives, then sweep in during the pullout phase. The German bombers, slow and climbing, were perfect targets. The slaughter began. On August 8th, Stukas attacked a convoy in the Channel and were intercepted by RAF fighters. 5 aircraft were shot down, more were damaged. On August 16th, Sturzkampfgeschwader 77 attacked the airfield at Tangmere. RAF Hurricanes and Spitfires were waiting. 4 Stukas were destroyed, including one whose crew somehow survived a crash landing, despite both being unconscious. On August 18th, the day the Germans would later call the hardest day, 16 Stukas were shot down in a single afternoon. The losses were catastrophic. In just 1 week, the Luftwaffe lost 20% of its entire Stuka force. Not damaged. Destroyed. Gone forever, along with the experienced crews who had flown them through Poland, Norway, and France. The numbers were unsustainable. Konrad Stahl, who had dismissed Erhard's warnings, who had declared the Luftwaffe invincible, was forced to face reality. On August 19th, he ordered all Stuka units withdrawn from the Battle of Britain. The Screaming Devils would no longer darken the skies over England. Erhard received the news at his office in Berlin. He sat alone in the gathering dusk, the report spread across his desk. The casualty figures blurred before his eyes. Names he recognized, men he had trained, pilots who had mastered the art of the vertical dive, who had believed in the weapon he had championed. Dead. He thought about the promise he had made to himself standing in that farmer's field outside Munich, with parachute silk settling around him. He had sworn to create an aircraft that could do what the Goshawk could not. An aircraft strong enough, precise enough, deadly enough to change the nature of warfare. He had succeeded. The Stuka had conquered Poland in weeks. It had broken France in days. It had terrorized soldiers and sailors across half of Europe. But now the bill was coming due. The truth that Erhard had always known, the truth he had tried to share with commanders who did not want to hear it, had been written in blood over the English Channel. The Stuka needed air superiority to survive. Without it, the dive bomber was nothing but a slow-moving target with a predictable flight path and inadequate defensive armament. It was a weapon designed for a specific set of conditions. When those conditions were met, it was devastating. When they were not, it was suicide. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority over Britain. The RAF, though battered, had not been broken. And so the Stuka had been broken instead. Erhard poured himself a drink, then another. He sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Berlin outside his window, wondering what would come next. The Stuka was not finished. He knew that. There were still theaters where the Luftwaffe controlled the skies. There were still enemies who lacked the fighter strength to challenge German air power. The dive bomber would continue to fly, continue to kill, continue to scream its terrible song. But something had changed. The myth of invincibility had been shattered. The weapon that was supposed to bring Britain to its knees had been driven from the battlefield. The limitations that Erhard had always understood were now visible to the world. He thought about the men who had died over England. He thought about the men who would die in the battles yet to come. He thought about the sirens he had demanded, the Jericho trumpets that announced death from above. How many had heard that sound in their final moments? How many more would hear it before the war was over? The questions haunted him as he sat alone in the darkness. The questions would continue to haunt him in the months and years ahead, until the morning when he found he could bear them no longer. The Stukas did not die over Britain. They retreated. They regrouped. They found new skies where the enemy could not reach them. In the autumn of 1940, while the Luftwaffe continued its bombing campaign against British cities, the battered dive bomber units were sent south, to the Mediterranean, to the Balkans, to the sun-baked lands where the Royal Air Force was spread thin and German air superiority could once again be established. It was a time of recovery, a time of healing, a time for pilots who had survived the nightmare over the Channel to regain their confidence. The missions in this theater were different from what had come before. The targets were often isolated. The opposition was scattered. The RAF stretched to its limits, defending Britain could spare few resources for the distant corners of the Mediterranean. The Stukas found their rhythm again. They struck British shipping off the coast of North Africa. They supported Italian forces, struggling against Greek defenders. They ranged across the Balkans, hitting bridges, rail lines, supply depots. The screaming sirens echoed across ancient landscapes where Alexander had marched, where Roman legions had conquered, where empires had risen and fallen for 3,000 years. It was, as some pilots called it, a time of milk runs, easy missions against weak opposition, a chance to rebuild shattered units and train replacement crews. But even as the Stukas recovered, the war was preparing to enter a new and terrible phase. In the east, beyond the forests of Poland, beyond the vast plains of the Soviet Union, Adolf Hitler was planning the largest military operation in human history. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia. Erhard Volker learned of the plans in early 1941. He was no longer the enthusiastic young officer who had championed the Stuka through years of development. The Battle of Britain had changed him. The reports of dead pilots, of burning aircraft, of formations torn apart by RAF fighters had left their mark. He slept poorly now. He drank more than he should. The face that stared back from his mirrors each morning seemed older than his 43 years. But the war machine did not care about his Dauans. 4 entire Sturzkampfgeschwader were assigned to Barbarossa. 4 wings of dive bombers representing the largest concentration of Stukas ever assembled. They would spearhead the invasion just as they had in Poland and France. They would shatter Soviet defenses, destroy the Red Air Force, pave the way for the Panzer divisions racing toward Moscow. The operation was scheduled to begin on June 22, 1941. Erhard reviewed the plans with growing unease. The distances involved were staggering. The Soviet Union was vast beyond comprehension, stretching across 11 time zones from the Baltic to the Pacific. Supply lines would be extended to their breaking point. The Luftwaffe would be operating at the very limits of its range, and the intelligence on Soviet air strength was troubling. The Red Air Force was enormous. Thousands of aircraft, many of them modern designs that could match German fighters. If even a fraction of that force survived the initial assault, the Stukas would face the same nightmare they had encountered over Britain. Erhard raised his concerns through official channels. He was told that the Soviets would be caught by surprise. He was told that their aircraft were inferior, their pilots poorly trained. He was told that the war in the East would be over in 6 weeks. He wanted to believe them. He could not. The invasion began at 3:15 in the morning. Across a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, 3 million German soldiers surged eastward. Tanks crashed through border defenses. Artillery shells screamed across the darkness. Infantry advanced behind the armor securing the ground the panzers had taken. And in the pre-dawn sky, the Luftwaffe struck. Their primary target was the Red Air Force. Destroy the enemy's aircraft on the ground, and the rest of the campaign would be simple. The Stukas would have clear skies for their work. The ground forces would advance without fear of aerial attack. The war would be won before the Soviets even knew what was happening. The results exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. By noon on the first day, German pilots reported that they had destroyed 1,489 Soviet aircraft. Fighters caught on the ground before they could take off. Bombers burned in their hangars. Fuel depots exploding in pillars of black smoke visible for miles. When Konrad Stahl heard the numbers, he refused to believe them. He ordered his staff to verify the claims by examining the wreckage at captured airfields. They came back with an even higher figure. More than 2,000 Soviet aircraft had been destroyed in the first 24 hours alone. It was the most devastating air victory in history. The Red Air Force had been crippled in a single day. With the skies cleared, the Stukas went to work. The terrain of Western Russia was perfect for dive bombing. Flat, open farmlands stretched to the horizon in every direction. There were no mountains to hide targets, no forests thick enough to provide cover. Soviet positions stood out against the landscape like targets on a practice range. The German ground commanders called for air support, and the Stukas answered. They dove on Soviet tanks trying to form defensive lines. They struck artillery batteries that were shelling advancing German forces. They destroyed supply convoys, bridges, railway junctions. They hunted down pockets of resistance that the panzers had bypassed, eliminating threats before they could become problems. The coordination between air and ground forces reached levels never before achieved in warfare. Radio communication allowed commanders to call in strikes within minutes. The Stukas would appear overhead, identify their targets, and dive. By the time the bombs stopped falling, German tanks were already rolling through the gaps. It was Poland all over again. It was France all over again, but on a scale that dwarfed everything that had come before. The Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of miles in the first weeks. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. The road to Moscow seemed open and undefended. Among the pilots who flew those early missions was a young officer named Helmut Riedel. Riedel was 25 years old when Barbarossa began. He had joined the Luftwaffe in 1938, trained as a dive bomber pilot, and flown his first combat missions during the invasion of Poland. He had survived France. He had survived Norway. He had even survived the Battle of Britain, though barely nursing a damaged aircraft back across the channel with his rear gunner bleeding from shrapnel wounds. But it was in Russia that Helmut Riedel would become a legend. He was not a large man. Photographs from the period show a slender figure with sharp features and pale eyes that seemed to look through whoever stood before him. His fellow pilots described him as quiet, methodical, almost mechanical in his approach to flying. He did not boast about his kills. He did not seek attention or glory. He simply flew his missions, reported his results, and prepared for the next sortie. In those first months of Barbarossa, Riedel flew mission after mission over the Soviet lines. He dove on tanks, on trucks, on troop concentrations. He learned to read the terrain below to identify targets that others might miss, to place his bombs with surgical precision. His kill count began to climb. 10 missions, 20, 50, 100. Each one added to his experience, honed his skills, refined his understanding of what the Stuka could do. He pushed the aircraft harder than most pilots dared, diving steeper, releasing later, pulling out closer to the ground. His fellow pilots thought he had a death wish. Riedel thought he was simply doing his job. By the end of 1941, he had flown over 400 combat missions. He had destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks, hundreds of vehicles, countless artillery pieces, and bunkers. He had been shot down twice, both times managing to nurse his crippled aircraft back to German lines before crash landing. He was becoming the most successful Stuka pilot in history. But the war was changing around him. And far away in Berlin, the man who had created the weapon Riedel flew so brilliantly was approaching the end of his own journey. The autumn of 1941 found Erhard Volker alone in his study. The room was dark except for a single lamp on his desk. Bottles lined the bookshelf behind him. Some were empty, some were not. The reports he had been reading were scattered across the desktop, their contents a mixture of triumph and tragedy. The Stukas were succeeding beyond all expectations on the Eastern Front. The kill counts were staggering. The impact on Soviet resistance was undeniable. Everything Erhard had promised, everything he had fought for during those long years of development, was being proven correct. And yet, the reports also contained other information. Casualty figures, loss rates, accounts of missions where entire formations had been caught by Soviet fighters and torn apart. The Red Air Force was rebuilding faster than anyone had anticipated. New aircraft were arriving from factories beyond the Ural Mountains. New pilots were being trained to replace those lost in the first days of the invasion. The pattern was familiar. It was Britain all over again. The enemy's air force had been battered but not destroyed. They were recovering, adapting, growing stronger. And when they reached sufficient strength, the Stukas would once again become prey instead of predators. But there was something else troubling Erhard, something deeper than tactical concerns. He had been reading reports from the occupied territories. The Stukas were not only attacking military targets, they were being used to terrorize civilian populations. Villages bombed, refugee columns strafed. The screaming sirens that Erhard had designed to break enemy morale were now shattering the lives of ordinary people who had nothing to do with the war. In Warsaw, in Rotterdam, at Dunkirk, and now across the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. The weapon he had created was being used for purposes he had never intended. Erhard thought about his daughter. Liesel was 19 now, a young woman with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn determination. He had not seen her in months. She was living with relatives in the countryside far from the bombing raids that had begun to target German cities. What would she think if she knew the truth? What would she say if she understood what her father had unleashed upon the world? He picked up the pistol that lay on his desk. It was a Walther P-38 standard issue for Luftwaffe officers. He had carried it throughout the war, though he had never fired it in anger. It was heavy in his hand, cold. The metal seemed to absorb the dim light of the lamp. Erhard thought about the pilots who had died over Britain. Young men who had believed in him, who had trusted that the weapon they flew was worth the risk. He thought about the civilians who had died under Stuka bombs, children who had heard the Jericho trumpets in their final moments. He thought about the dream he had carried back from Cleveland, standing among the crowds at that air show, watching the Goshawk dive toward the earth and pull out at the last possible moment. It had seemed so clean then, so pure, a technical challenge to be solved, a capability to be developed, a tool that would give Germany an advantage in the wars that everyone knew were coming. He had not considered the human cost. He had not imagined the screaming. The pistol was still in his hand. Erhard stared at it for a long time. Then he raised it to his temple. The official report stated that Erhard Volker died on November 17, 1941, as the result of an accident while cleaning his service weapon. No one believed it, but no one contradicted it either. In wartime, questions were dangerous. Investigations were inconvenient. The official story was accepted, filed, and forgotten. Erhard was buried with full military honors, his medals displayed on a velvet cushion beside his casket. Konrad Stahl delivered a eulogy praising his contributions to German aviation. No one mentioned the empty bottles found in his study. No one mentioned the letter he had left behind. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, perhaps to his daughter, perhaps to the pilots who flew his creation, perhaps to the ghosts that had haunted his final months. It spoke of regret, of guilt, of the terrible weight of responsibility for a weapon that had killed so many. It ended with a single line. The sky was never meant to scream. The letter was quietly destroyed. The circumstances of Erhard's death were classified. The man who had brought dive bombing to Germany, who had fought to save the Ju-87 from cancellation, who had demanded the sirens that terrorized half of Europe, simply ceased to exist. The war continued without him. The winter of 1941 brought the German advance to a halt. The Wehrmacht had pushed to the gates of Moscow close enough that some units could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But the Russian winter was brutal beyond anything the Germans had prepared for. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Engines froze. Weapons jammed. Soldiers died of exposure in numbers that rivaled combat losses. The Stukas suffered along with everyone else. The aircraft had not been designed for such conditions. Lubricants thickened in the cold. Hydraulic systems failed. Engines refused to start. Ground crews worked with bare hands on frozen metal, their skins sticking to the surfaces they touched. Flight operations continued, but at a reduced tempo. The dive bombers that had seemed invincible in the summer now struggled just to get airborne. And the Soviets were not idle. Throughout the winter, the Red Air Force continued to rebuild. New aircraft arrived from factories that had been relocated beyond the Urals, safe from German bombing. New pilots completed their training and were sent to the front. By the spring of 1942, Soviet air strength had recovered to levels that matched or exceeded what had existed before Barbarossa. The Stukas began to encounter resistance again. It started slowly, a formation intercepted here, a few aircraft lost there. Nothing like the disaster over Britain, but enough to remind the German pilots that they were no longer masters of the sky. Helmut Riedel noticed the change. He had continued flying throughout the winter, accumulating missions at a rate that seemed impossible. 500 sorties, 600, 700. His skill had grown along with his experience. He knew the Stuka better than anyone alive, understood its capabilities and limitations with an intimacy that bordered on the mystical. But he also understood what the increasing Soviet resistance meant. The days of easy hunting were ending. The days of diving on helpless targets without fear of interception were over. The war was entering a new phase, one where the Stuka's fundamental weaknesses would once again be exposed. He wrote to his wife about his concerns. She saved the letters, and they would later be published as part of a collection of wartime correspondence. "The sky is getting crowded," he wrote in the spring of 1942. "We are no longer alone up there. The Russians are learning, adapting, getting stronger. I do not know how long our advantage will last." His words proved prophetic. The Battle of Stalingrad began in August of 1942. The German 6th Army advanced toward the city on the Volga River, supported by the largest concentration of air power the Eastern Front had yet seen. Stukas flew constant missions pounding Soviet positions, supporting infantry attacks, trying to break the fierce resistance that greeted every German advance. But Stalingrad was different from anything that had come before. The city itself became a fortress. Soviet defenders fought from building to building, room to room. The rubble created by German bombing provided perfect cover for snipers and machine gun nests. The Stukas could destroy a block of apartments only to find that the ruins were even harder to capture than the intact structures had been. And in the sky above, the Red Air Force was present in force. For the first time since the early days of Barbarossa, Soviet fighters appeared in numbers sufficient to challenge German air superiority. They were not yet as skilled as their opponents, but they were brave, determined, and increasingly well-equipped. The latest Soviet designs could match the Messerschmitt 109 in speed and maneuverability. The Stukas began to take losses, not the catastrophic losses of Britain, but steady attrition that wore down the dive bomber units month after month. Experienced pilots were killed or wounded. Replacement crews arrived with less training than their predecessors. The quality of Stuka operations began to decline even as the quantity of missions increased. When the Soviet counteroffensive began in November encircling the German forces at Stalingrad, the Stukas were called upon to support the desperate attempts to break the siege. They flew through blizzards, through anti-aircraft fire that grew denser every day, through swarms of Soviet fighters that seemed to multiply with each passing week. By the time Stalingrad fell in February of 1943, the Stuka force on the Eastern Front had been bled nearly white. The response to the crisis came from an unexpected direction. Rather than replacing the Stuka with a new aircraft, the Luftwaffe decided to transform it. If the Ju-87 could no longer survive as a dive bomber, perhaps it could find new life in a different role. The result was the G model. The Ju-87G was a tank killer. Gone were the dive brakes that had defined the aircraft since its creation. Gone was the bomb release mechanism that swung payloads clear of the propeller. Gone in most cases were even the Jericho trumpets that had made the Stuka's scream famous across Europe. In their place were two massive 37mm cannons mounted beneath the wings like the talons of a predatory bird. The concept was simple. Soviet tanks were proving devastatingly effective against German ground forces. The standard Stuka bomb load was not always sufficient to destroy heavily armored vehicles. But the 37mm guns could punch through tank armor from above, where the protection was weakest. A skilled pilot approaching at low altitude and firing from behind or the side could destroy a tank with just one or two hits. Helmut Rydell was among the first to fly the new variant. He took to the tank killing role with the same methodical precision that had characterized his career. He studied Soviet armor, learning where the weak points were, how to identify different types of vehicles, how to approach for maximum effect. He practiced until he could place his shots exactly where they needed to go. The results were remarkable. In the summer of 1943, during the massive tank battle at Kursk, Rydell claimed 12 Soviet tanks destroyed in a single day. His total for the Kursk offensive exceeded 50 armored vehicles. By the end of the year, he had become the most successful anti-tank pilot in history. His final tally would be staggering. Over the course of the war, Helmut Rydell flew 2,530 combat missions. He destroyed over 500 Soviet tanks along with countless other vehicles, artillery pieces, and fortified positions. He was shot down 30 times, wounded 5 times, and continued flying despite injuries that would have grounded lesser men. He became the most decorated German serviceman of the Second World War. But even his extraordinary skills could not change the fundamental trajectory of the conflict. By 1944, the Stuka was obsolete. The aircraft that had terrorized Europe, that had led the blitzkrieg across Poland and France, that had sunk ships and shattered armies, was now a relic of an earlier age. Faster, more versatile designs had taken its place. The Focke-Wulf 190, originally developed as a fighter, proved equally capable in the ground attack role while being far better able to defend itself against enemy aircraft. The remaining Stuka units were gradually converted to FW-190 or disbanded entirely. A few continued to fly, particularly on the Eastern Front, where Helmut Rydell and his fellow tank killers still found targets for their cannons. But their numbers dwindled with each passing month. Replacement aircraft were no longer being produced. Replacement pilots were no longer being trained. The scream of the Stuka, once the soundtrack of German conquest, was falling silent. In the spring of 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from the east, and American and British forces advanced from the west, a handful of Stukas still flew over the dying Reich. They attacked Soviet tanks in the suburbs of the capital. They flew reconnaissance missions over enemy positions. They did what they could to slow the inevitable. Helmut Riedel was among them, still flying, still fighting, still accumulating missions long after most of his comrades had been killed or captured. On April 28, 1945, 2 days before Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the burning streets of Berlin, Riedel flew his final combat mission. His target was a Soviet armored column approaching the city from the south. He dove on the tanks, fired his cannons, destroyed 2 vehicles, and limped home on an engine that had been damaged by ground fire. It was his 2,530th mission. The war ended 8 days later. When the guns finally fell silent, fewer than 100 Ju-87 Stukas remained operational in German hands. An aircraft that had once numbered in the thousands, that had equipped dozens of squadrons across multiple fronts, had been reduced to a handful of survivors, scattered among the wreckage of a defeated nation. The factories that had built them were rubble. The airfields where they had been based were occupied by enemy forces. The pilots who had flown them were dead, captured, or struggling to survive in the chaos of post-war Germany. The age of the Stuka was over, but its legacy would endure. The lessons learned from the Ju-87 would shape aerial warfare for generations to come. The concept of close air support of aircraft working in direct coordination with ground forces would become a fundamental doctrine of military aviation. The techniques of dive bombing would be refined and improved, incorporated into new designs that address the Stuka's limitations while preserving its strengths. And the memory of that sound, the wailing scream of the Jericho trumpets, would haunt the survivors of Stuka attacks for the rest of their lives. Veterans of Dunkirk, of Stalingrad, of 100 other battles would wake in the night decades later, still hearing that terrible noise. They would flinch at unexpected sounds that reminded them of diving aircraft. They would carry the psychological scars of Stuka attacks long after the physical wounds had healed. The weapon that Erhard Volker had created, the weapon he could not live with having created, had left its mark on history. Epilogue. In the summer of 1962, an elderly American veteran visited the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. His name was Thomas Whitmore. He was 64 years old, a retired factory worker from Pennsylvania. He walked with a slight limp, the result of a wound he had received at Dunkirk in the spring of 1940. He had never spoken much about the war. His wife knew that he had been evacuated from France, that he had been wounded, that he had spent months in a hospital recovering. But the details remained locked away, too painful to share. Now, more than 20 years later, he had finally decided to confront his past. The Smithsonian had recently acquired a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, one of only a handful surviving in the world. It was displayed in the aviation gallery, suspended from the ceiling, as if frozen in the act of diving toward the earth. Thomas Whitmore stood beneath it for a long time. The aircraft was smaller than he remembered. The inverted gull wings, the fixed landing gear, the greenhouse canopy over the cockpit. All the details were exactly as they had been that day on the beach, when the sky had filled with screaming demons and the sand had erupted around him in fountains of fire. He could still hear it. Even now, standing in the quiet gallery surrounded by school children, on field trips, and tourists snapping photographs, he could hear the wail of the sirens. The sound that had haunted his dreams for more than 2 decades. The sound that had killed his friends. A docent approached, offering information about the aircraft, its specifications, its history, its role in the war. Thomas listened politely, nodded at the appropriate moments, said nothing about his own experience. When the docent moved on to the next group, Thomas remained. He thought about the men who had flown this aircraft. Young Germans, probably no older than he had been when the war began. They had families, dreams, fears. They had climbed into the cockpits of these machines and dove toward the earth at 400 miles per hour, trusting in their training and their equipment to bring them home alive. Some of them had succeeded. Many of them had not. Thomas thought about the man who had designed the Stuka. He had read somewhere that the chief designer had killed himself during the war. Unable to bear the guilt of what his creation had done, he understood that feeling better than most. He had carried his own guilt for years, the guilt of surviving when others had not, the guilt of leaving friends behind on that burning beach, the guilt of coming home to a life that those friends would never have. But standing there beneath the silent aircraft that had once been his nightmare, Thomas Whitmore felt something unexpected. Peace. The war was over. The Stuka was just a museum piece, now harmless, frozen in time. The men who had flown it, the men who had created it, the men who had died beneath its bombs were all part of history. And history, Thomas realized, was not a burden to be carried. It was a lesson to be learned. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a piece of shrapnel about the size of a coin. He had carried it since Dunkirk, a souvenir of the wound that had nearly killed him. For a moment, he considered leaving it there beneath the Stuka, a memorial to everyone who had suffered because of this aircraft, to the soldiers on the beaches, to the sailors on the ships, to the pilots in the cockpits, to the man in Berlin who had pulled the trigger on himself rather than face what he had done. But in the end, he put the shrapnel back in his pocket. Some things were not meant to be left behind. Some things were meant to be carried. Thomas Whitmore took one last look at the Ju-87 Stuka, then turned and walked away. The gallery was quiet behind him. The aircraft hung motionless in the still air, and the sky at